Good morning and welcome to our latest webinar, all about DSE assessments. And actually, I have to say, I'm really quite excited about the session today. It's very close to my heart, and going back to sort of the days of yore, it's, I suppose, been embedded with my career ever since I started, 30 years ago. In fact, over 30 years ago, when the DSE directive came out and the DSE regulations followed. I was working then, and I do remember very vividly treating my first RSI case. So it's been very much part of my career. So I'm hoping that I can share the passion, I suppose, with you today. Also, I'm not alone today. I've got several of my colleagues and a colleague from outside Posturite as well joining us today. I've got Neil Duff, who's one of our assessors, John White, who's one of our key account managers, and Huw Jones from Zurich, who uses our assessment services, joining me today. So as I say, I'm hoping you'll enjoy the session. So a little bit of housekeeping for you today. We are recording this session and you will be sent a copy of the recording. So please, if you have any technical problems, be assured you will have a copy, and it'll also be available on our website with our other webinars. So that's a great thing. I'd love this to be slightly interactive. We do want to take your questions, and I am going to put questions to my colleagues, and I might even answer some myself at the end of the session. So please use the Q&A box if you can for your questions. It'll help me sort of sift through them. We do have the chat function available if you want to chat to ourselves or our colleagues, but please, if you could put the questions in the Q&A, that would be great. So really, without further ado, let's get on to the session. So please can I have my first slide? Why do we undertake DSE assessments? Well, let's start with the basics. Let's start with the legal duty that we have. Now, before even I started working, we have the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act, where an employer has a duty of care to all their employees. Now, if we had computers back in 1974, they would be covered. Just like if we were working at home with the computers, we would be covered. So that duty existed long before we had the DSE regulations that we talk so much about today. Now, the DSE regulations came about in 1992. And this is where these fundamental bits of requirement come in. So we need to do risk assessment. So we need to do a risk assessment of any workstation that can be used for the undertaking by the company. So that will include offices, at home, shared working. So very much will embrace hybrid working. So this is one of the main reasons we need to do DSE assessments. Let's also not forget, though, the regulations not only required assessment, they required to make sure while doing the assessment, you made sure all the equipment met certain minimum requirements, not particularly onerous, but it helps guide us in making sure the problems don't occur for people. Also, it requires breaks and changes of activity, something very important to all of us, but certainly for me as a physiotherapist. We know that no matter how good the workstation is, people still need to move. So we need to do a risk assessment, but we also need to be aware of the way people work as well. And at the end, we also required to provide training in setup of a workstation, in assessments, and also we need to provide information for people. So really important, we have a legal duty to do risk assessments, DSE risk assessments, but that's not just there because of the law, it's there because it helps prevent the negative outputs if we don't get these things right. So with that in mind, can I have the next slide, please? Pinned by the regulations requiring us to do a risk assessment, we are wanting to prevent any ill health for our employees. That can be both physical and mental concerns. I myself, if systems aren't working well, I can become quite anxious and quite stressed by it. So mental health as well as physical problems can be occurred if we don't do our assessments properly. And also, we've got to make reasonable adjustments for people. Everyone has different requirements, different needs. And when we do a risk assessment, we're able to try and facilitate accommodation of any requirements people have. And this leads on very much to productivity. If we get our assessments right and we focus on the person and where they work, we'll stop pain and discomfort. Now, if you remember the last time you had a headache or you had pain, you know just what an impact that has on your productivity because it is distracting. So not only are we looking to prevent pain, but also any distraction that might cause. We need to make sure that the workstation is set up so people work efficiently. And that, I think, more than ever, as things change and move, it's very important we look at that. And reduce management time. If we get the workstation set up, people can do their work properly, people are efficient, people do not develop musculoskeletal, eyesight, or fatigue-related problems. The management of that individual becomes far less. It runs on managing them effectively doing their work rather than being sidetracked by some of these other problems. So really, I hope that really gives you a basis of why I think we need to do risk assessments, DSE assessments. We have a legal obligation to do that because we are trying to prevent the negative outcomes that are poor for people, but also poor for productivity. Really, I'd like to now pass on to my colleague, Neil. Neil is one of our assessors and so lives and breathes DSE assessment day in, day out. So I think really without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Neil to give us his take on DSE assessments.
Hi everyone, thanks for that, Catherine. So hopefully what you should be seeing on your screen is just a new poll that's going to pop up. So feel free to get involved, and it's all to do with how do you prefer assessments to be delivered if you've had a DSE assessment in the past. So a little bit about myself. So I'm often asked by family, friends, and even clients, what do you actually do as a DSE assessor? Like, what does your job entail? So the short answer is it's extremely varied, but I'm currently based in Edinburgh. And I do travel sort of the entirety of Scotland and sometimes northeast of England, carrying out a variety of face-to-face DSE assessments. And basically what I see my job is basically assessing needs, whether that's equipment-based or not, across different sectors and health boards, and which has allowed me to meet a vast variety of people, from lords and ladies to ex-militaries to helping just new starts in the ex-military as well. So with this variety of stakeholders, I have actually had the sort of opportunity to assess a variety of different workstations as well, from the pathology labs in the NHS, but also a bit more interestingly, also control rooms in prison blocks, for example. So it's really varied my day to day. So what actually is a DSE assessment, apart from the sort of legislation side of things? So I see a DSE assessment as very much the sort of building blocks, if you will, and the bridge between a health and safety report, which all is to do with the risks of a workstation, also the occupational health side of things. And basically, I'm looking at the effect of equipment or lack of equipment, which is quite often is having on an individual's posture and overall well-being. So factors such as job type, hours of sitting, height and weight are all considered during every assessment. On average, I'm maybe carrying out sort of 5 to 10 assessments a day, depending on mileage coverage. So especially over the sort of last couple of years with that pandemic, virtual assessments, so virtual DSE assessments have really been the forefront of what Posturite have been able to offer. At the moment, I would say I'm on average, I'm carrying about 10 assessments out a week, usually over Microsoft Teams. So if you've not had an assessment over Teams, especially if you can't quite sort of fathom how that would come to pass, it's basically factors such as client location, time restraints, and end user well-being. So for example, if they were isolating due to COVID, we could still actually carry out a DSE assessment over the phone or over Teams and help them out with their either home setup or office setups if they're able to provide pictures. There's many benefits to go through virtual assessments, such as quicker appointment proposals, because instead of just, if you were based in Edinburgh, like myself, it very much would be diary based. But if you went down the route of virtual assessments, you could have any of our assessments in the UK. There's also less cost to the business, which I mean John might touch on, and also offers end users don't actually leave the comfort of their own home as well. So this shift towards agile working as a result of the pandemic has presented its own sort of risk factors, which virtual assessments can help with. For example, I often sort of carry out a face-to-face assessment and the end user has mentioned that they are doing agile working as well, so part home and part office. So I can actually offer a Teams assessment with myself, just to repeat any rework and going over sort of personal information with one of my colleagues. So that's actually done quite often. I would say roughly 60% of my current weekly assessments are clients who've developed MSK, so musculoskeletal discomforts, as a result of working from home without the correct setup. So that's quite a significant amount. And just finally, start to finish process is exactly what I do on a day-to-day basis. So whether that's the request comes through to ourselves or our appointments team, I'll then carry out this assessment. I'll then make the recommendations through occupational health to management, whoever's put that original request through. And then either myself or one of our technicians will actually come on site and help build this equipment, whether that's a chair, desk, or just general advice around sort of IT settings if need be. So every assessment is unique, which means a sort of subjective, non-biased approach really is key. Unfortunately, not all standardized setups will work with all members of staff, even if they are compliant. I'm 6'7", so I'm a good example of this. So you really need to treat all members of staff as unique and each to their own, really. This day-to-day challenge of the unknown is what I personally love to see, and seeing the process from start to finish really does give me a sense of achievement. Can I just get the next slide, please? So is your DSE compliant? So obviously that's been mentioned a few times now. So during a virtual assessment or a face-to-face assessment, the very basic markers, the first question I'm asking myself is this workstation compliant? Very simply, yes or no. The compliances are driven through acts mentioned earlier by Catherine, but in real-time application, what that actually means for myself day-to-day is they're sort of executed through procurement of relevant equipment, chair, desk, whatever it might be. Education of associated risk factors, so for example, prolonged sitting and the risks around that, which we'll come on to. But also awareness of entitlements such as eye tests, which many people don't know about. So if you've got any questions around that, I would just speak to management and see exactly what they can offer. Like I mentioned, just because a DSE workstation is deemed compliant, it doesn't necessarily mean it is suitable. So the next point is also about the fluidity of workstations. So what I mean by that is the fluidity into the entire workstation is vital to support individuals, especially if they're experiencing musculoskeletal discomfort. Sometimes it really is the smallest overlooked change can make the biggest difference in terms of comfort of support. So for example, I am quite often on the back of the pandemic, I'm assessing a lot of people that have a neck discomfort, as you can imagine, possibly looking down or whatever, at laptops, whatever it might be. However, introducing a footrest, because maybe their feet support's not quite correct, which means their hip angle, shoulder placement, all these factors do work together to make sure the overall support is there. So yes, I might be there to help somebody's neck support. However, we really do look at the whole workstation to make sure it is fluid and works together. As you can imagine, ergonomic and the equipment, it really does change almost on a daily basis, especially software. So that means with the advice we provide needs to be relevant, up to date. So a good example of this is that, it was a sort of old-fashioned approach to DSE was, let's look at the chair, let's get this chair changed, and that will cure everything. That's not quite the case. The reason being is basically what we want to do is, a good example is this, originally for many years, that when we sat with a 90-degree hip angle, so many studies have shown that this 90-degree hip angle may cause a slight rotation in your hips and pelvis, which can actually lengthen the muscles in your lower back. So this is just sort of older advice that we believe true. Actually, recent studies have shown that we actually want our hips slightly higher than our knees. So that's what all assessors now advise to all clients. So what I'm going to challenge you to do now is just have a look at your hip angle right now. And if your hips are in line with your knees, that slight rotation could be affecting your posture just now. So all you need to do is just put your seat out slightly higher, and that can sort of emit that risk and just help with improve your posture. So you should actually be able to feel you can sit up a little bit straighter. What I've alluded to as well is just that sitting for prolonged periods, is quite an old-fashioned approach, is that, like say, the chair will sort everything. However, when we all sit, even on a brand new chair, our spines naturally compress, and that can aggravate individuals with chronic pain or even just a sort of acute stiffness. Ideally, we should all move away from our desks every sort of 45 minutes. However, I appreciate this is often easier said than done. This is where benefits of having a sit-stand workstation comes into play, whether that's through a platform or sit-stand desk. So quite a lot of assessments I'm carrying out as well, sort of day to day. I'll get told, you know, a physio has recommended that I need to stand. So one of these options could be a way to sort of help introduce that into somebody's workstation. And a DSE assessment would just be a good way to determine what would work with that individual space, their discomfort, and also business costs, because that's important. And then just finally, regular review really is important day to day for all members of staff, but also we sort of recommend that regular review. If I've done an assessment, we recommend that they are reviewed or at least talked to every single year to make sure that nothing has changed. The pandemic has been a good example to show that business demands in users' physical and mental well-being really can change overnight. So these do need to be reviewed quite regularly, and Posturite can help with that moving forward with this sort of ever-changing world. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the poll. So hopefully you can all see that 55% of everyone that's chosen has actually had a face-to-face assessment in the past. So hopefully you can see that there is actually some merit to virtual. And you know, feel free to get in contact with us about using that moving forward. So thank you for listening to me. I'm going to pass the baton back to Catherine and Huw, who are just going to discuss hybrid working.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Neil. Yes, so gosh, on to now Huw Jones from Zurich. A poor soul has known me a long time, and we've been on various sort of health and safety groups together and that type of thing. So Huw has put up with me quite a lot. So I think no surprise that I'm going to ask him a few questions. So are you ready, Huw, for a few questions? Because you use Posturite, don't you, to deliver some of your services? What are you doing? In fact, what do you think most businesses are doing with hybrid working at the moment?
I think most people are probably panicking, if I'm totally honest. Let's get real. I think COVID accelerated hybrid working by about 4 to 5 years, and organizations were moving towards a hybrid platform, but it just became accelerated, and we're all probably catching up a little bit. So what we have done internally is review our position. So we've got a dedicated group of home workers, so they're easy to manage, and the approach is that they get equipment as they need, as if they were office-based. And with our home workers, what we're trying to do at the moment is to ensure that we're giving them all the support we can in terms of understanding what they should have at home. And to do that, we're using various means, so internal communications and software with training and assessment built in. No surprise, Catherine, that we're using the old Posturite platform, which is now moved across to IdeaGen, but we're still using it.
Excellent. A lot of time and hard work went into that, Huw. So I'm glad you're using it.
Yeah, it works. So that's enabling us to give the right information to people. What we're then having to do is get them to understand that they're choosing to be hybrid workers. We're not forcing them. Like most organizations, we're running offices. We'd like to see people in our offices, that people see the benefit of being away from the office, whether that be at home, whether it be a coffee shop, whether it be somewhere else that they choose to work from. So we have to equip them. I also have to recognize, as an organization of our size, we had a lot of resources available to us when pandemic struck, and we were able to issue a lot of equipment to people for use at home, which we haven't dragged back. So a lot of our people have got desks and chairs that a hybrid worker probably wouldn't normally. But those who are joining the organization now, it's about support, guidance, information, and making sure we've assessed them. If the assessment identifies there is a gap, we then discuss with the individual and or the manager as appropriate to put remedial actions in place. In a small number of cases, it may mean they can't hybrid work, that they have to be office-based. So there's lots of little things, but the catch-up is the hardest bit at the moment.
Do you think that people are thinking clearly when making choices? If they're given the option, do you think people are thinking clearly about what's good to be done at home and what's good to be done in the office? Or do you think there are other factors possibly at play here?
I think there's loads of factors. I don't think they think it through. I think there is a shiny result that they want, that they're at home. They're not incurring travel costs. They're not incurring travel time. They're able to pick up the little ones from school or be around to go and see elderly parents during the day, things they wouldn't do if they were in the office. And there's a real benefit to your well-being from those sorts of things. And we actively encourage that. But I don't think people think through the implications of the poor posture at home if they haven't got a proper workstation set up. I've done a number of calls where people have been sat on sofas in lounges, and doing a call is fine. But if they then adopt that as their work position for the rest of the working day, that's when our issues start. Neil mentioned that a lot of people are now being referred because of musculoskeletal pain. We're seeing an increase in the number of internal assessments we're doing because people are expressing discomfort. And when you say to them, so where do you work from? Oh, I sit in the lounge, it's comfy. Yeah, it might be comfy, but it's not the ideal position for a long-term comfort when you're working. So I think they see the end result as being, I'm at home, I'm saving nice, it's easy. They don't think through the postural issues. And I also think there are still a lot of people who are fearful that mass public places such as buses, trains, etc., are breeding grounds for COVID and other infections. So you have to balance somebody's well-being within all of this as well.
Yeah. Do you think that actually proactive assessments allows people to stop and think about these things a little bit more seriously, whereas perhaps if we didn't give them those opportunities, perhaps things would go along until they got pain? Definitely.
Yeah. And I also, I'm going to say this, I probably shouldn't, but I think there's also a male-female divide within that. I think blokes generally will sit and suffer a lot longer. They don't think it through. I think females are thinking it through better from our experiences. We get more individuals come to us who are male currently expressing discomfort, whereas female colleagues are coming to us going, look, I'm going to be working from home. What do I need to do? Now, that might be just within our organisation, and it might be that we've just been fortunate that's the way the phone calls have gone. But there is, I think it highlights.
Yeah, it highlights just how complex the whole situation is, isn't it? Yeah. And the balance that people are making when making choices. And I think our jobs as employers is to make sure that we give people the opportunity to think about the factors in place and to make the right decisions. And I think, the DSE assessment of the past, where everybody's workstation was the same in an office, is different from what it is now, and fulfills actually probably a more important role now, in my opinion, because of all this change and everything else going on.
It's long gone. The standard workstation has long gone. I don't think there is such a thing anymore. I was chatting to one of our senior managers the other day who was talking through his day with me about comfort. So he generally starts from home 7:30, does a couple of hours. He was then off to see some brokers, so was working in the broker's office, sitting in the coffee area, chatting. He was then off to another meeting where he'd be sat in a boardroom. He was then having a gap of about an hour and a half where he would sit in a coffee shop. I won't mention any because there's loads available these days. And then he was on a train before he went home. And in any given day, a lot of people will work in 2, 3, 4 different places, and everyone brings a challenge. And I think the key for me is getting people to understand they should do in each of those environments. And you and I have spoken in the past about sitting in a coffee shop with some earbuds in, listening to a call is fine. Sitting in a coffee shop, writing up a report on a low table in a poorly designed chair for musculoskeletal support is not the answer. And it's getting people to understand that and think it through. And that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I really hope that, as I say, the DSE assessment gives that pause for thought and the opportunity to discuss with somebody who understands the issues to actually come up with a good solution. I actually think hybrid working is brilliant. It gets people moving more and gives people choice and control. So I think with the right controls in place, I think it's a great thing. But we've got to make sure that people have got the information and access to people to have that, haven't we?
I think there's also another aspect to it in that organizations need to trust their people.
Yeah.
If you're choosing to hybrid work on a given day and your hybrid environment is home, if you decide to take the dog for a walk at 10 o'clock in the morning and listen into a call or participate in a call whilst you're walking the dog, it's not an issue.
Mm.
And in fact, it's actually good for the individual, which means it's good for you. We always see things like little pictures showing that if you're sat, ideas sort of drip out of a tap, whereas if you walk, it's a waterfall of ideas. And we have to accept that we need to change and let people have some own responsibility as adults to make the best of what is in front of them. That means walking and talking, then do it.
Yeah.
Just walk and write a report on your iPhone.
Yeah. No, I think that is so important. Huw, we could chat for hours, and we usually do, don't we? So I won't. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I hope that that's been useful for other people going through the same process. And so we will catch up later. But I'm going to hand over to another colleague now. So speak to you later, Huw. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, John White, who is an account manager for us. John, I've been interesting listening to what Huw had to say there. And I'm sure a lot of your colleagues and your clients actually feel the same way. But I won't put words in your mouth. I shall leave it to you. I shall see you in a minute.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, thank you. Actually, yeah, some of the things that Huw mentioned there, I'm going to kind of directly quote as we kind of really what I wanted to do was just summarize some of the things that we've gone through and to make everybody aware of how Posturite and the services that we have available may be able to support with some of the new ways of working that we find ourselves in. So if we can have the next slide, please. So I'll begin by just stating the obvious, actually, in the fact that we know that the working environment has changed. And perhaps interestingly, as Huw mentioned, not necessarily just because of the pandemic. Actually, we were moving towards hybrid working, I think, before the pandemic. But as Huw picked up upon, it really accelerated it by many years. And what that's kind of left us with now is a situation that, again, as Huw mentioned, I don't think that we're going to go back to previous ways of working. I think we find ourselves in a way now that will be sustainable going forwards, and that leaves us potentially with people having multiple workstations. You know, we might commonly think of the office and a home environment, but as Huw and Catherine were talking about there, that can involve 3 or 4 workstations quite comfortably throughout the day for people. So that does leave us with extra challenges, and so we have more workstations that we need to be aware of. But what we just wanted to summarize really is that here at Posturite, we have the resources and the systems to be able to support you with these. So to be able to conduct these assessments wherever and however in a way that seems fit. So as Neil mentioned, there's multiple ways that we are providing assessments for our clients. There's the face-to-face, I suppose what people might consider the classic Posturite DSE assessment that we've been doing for many years. But as I mentioned, we realized as hybrid working was coming that we needed to be able to adapt our services to meet these new demands. So remote assessments are something that we started doing pre-pandemic and then really accelerated as a result of COVID and things. And for a while was our sole means of conducting our DSE assessments. Now we found ourselves moved back towards probably close to a 50-50 split between assessments, which has been interesting for us. Perhaps people might have suspected that we, like so many things in life, just fold back into original ways of working and everything would go face to face. But interestingly, as the poll results reflected, the second most common answer was it's dependent on the situation. So if I think of some of my clients, they would use both face-to-face and remote assessments, really dependent on the need. I think there's pros and cons to both. And as a result of the situations that present themselves, people make an informed decision to choose one of those two services. We also conduct high-level assessments. So this is really perhaps for cases that you might consider above and beyond the normal forms of musculoskeletal issues. So this might be if we're moving towards higher level issues, disability, and those more perhaps complex cases. What we're able to do is conduct what we term a higher level of assessment to dive into some of that detail a little bit further. And an option that has become quite popular of late is our less formal, what we term workstation checkup. So just to explain the difference about this very briefly, if we can move on to the next slide for me, please. Really what this involves is having an assessor at your disposal, really. So people typically use this for us to come on site and do what we might term floor walks, where we can walk around and have informal chats with your employees. So really, this has been used quite commonly as people are moving back towards the office. Perhaps if people are trying to transition from being a solely home worker to having their time back in the office, and they've perhaps adopted poorer workstation setups, habits, is then reminding them of these good habits, how they can take 5 minutes at the start of the day to adjust their posture and make sure that they're set up correctly. We can also have a discussion with people around any musculoskeletal issues that they are suffering and provide them with ergonomic advice that may be beneficial for their symptoms. We can also look at any risk factors that might be available, perhaps whether there's been damaged equipment that people might not have been realised where it hasn't been used as much. And we can look to highlight some of this information to the relevant staff. And we can also signpost employees really towards any internal resources that you may have. Lots of our clients have come up with new initiatives around the new ways of working. So they've been using our assessors to provide these informal chats, but also to signpost them towards those initiatives and the resources that are available to them. And then at the end of all that, we provide a summary of our discussions and findings. So really, as a complete summary, we are in a position now where we can offer a multitude of different types of assessments to really look to support our clients with their needs. So whether that's remote assessments, the face-to-face assessments, the higher level assessments, or the more informal ways of what we might term ergonomic advice. And I think that's kind of everything from me from a summary point of view. So I think I now hand back over to Catherine and we discuss any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, and in fact, I'm going to sort of start with the questions with one that is directly related to you, John. We've got a gentleman who's saying that he uses the Workrite system, but they're struggling to get people to complete the course. And how can they sort of raise awareness? And I just wondered whether that might be something with a walk around, raising awareness and encouraging people to use the systems. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's firstly, it's a common question that we have. I think like most things, there's huge benefits to e-learning as a way of covering the assessments, but perhaps one of the difficulties for people is getting the take up. So firstly, I would say making sure that the system is set up correctly in terms of perhaps revisiting some of the wording around the reminders. Perhaps if there's any further internal support available that might add some weight to those reminders can be helpful. But yes, I think, as you said, Catherine, are kind of more informal ways now in the modern way of hybrid working of just highlighting to people the internal resources. So floor walking is one of those common ways. And now in this digital era, another thing that we are doing more and more of is these type of webinars. So again, perhaps webinars around addressing why the e-learning packages can be so helpful. And these can be recorded and then sent out. So it might be an alternative means of communication to get across the fact of the importance of the e-learning.
I think that's a very important point, actually, is it's using different ways to raise awareness, to get people to engage, to check the basics, isn't it? So no, that's a great point. Thank you, John. Neil, I think we've got one directly for you. Just wondered if you're able to view setup via the screen when on Teams. Whatever you're doing clearly works, they were saying. So could maybe just to explain how you gain the information, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the sort of key points that we need prior to the assessment is basically we ask all clients to provide measurements, but also pictures. So there'll be a sort of profile picture from behind, side on from the desk. And what that allows us to do is physically see the posture at the deemed setup. So, you know, using the pandemic again, this is something we can all relate to, is working off a dining room chair, dining room table. So yes, you know, face-to-face conversation or over Teams, I would be able to possibly see like their IT setup, like a laptop keyboard potentially, but the pictures really do, you know, provide us with that information to see how that sort of posture is actually physically affected by the posture, by the equipment. And that's not necessarily in a bad way, that could be in a good way as well. So yeah, that's an absolute must for those all virtual assessments, really.
Brilliant, thank you for that. We have a very interesting one about the provision of a chair, where a member of staff is saying that they're getting backache and they want to sort of get a chair. You know, should they just be allowed to select the chair of their own choice? Oh, I don't know. Who wants to take that one?
I mean,
I have. John, you're in there.
The only reason I dive in on that one is just one word of warning around that, and I'm sure Neil and Catherine, you could develop on this. But in terms of real life experience with clients, initially, I think in the panic of the pandemic, these kind of things happened, and people were provided budget to go and get their own equipment. Now, the real life difficulties that some of my clients have had with that is that perhaps even chairs were selected, one, that were perhaps not fit for purpose, and two, perhaps not even DSE compliant. So now clients have been left with the issues of when they then come to conduct DSE assessments, chairs have been purchased that don't meet the basic needs. I think the other thing I would always say is, and I think we discussed this earlier in talking about things like, we know that perhaps sitting on the sofa is comfortable, but we know also that that's not a long-term solution for us to be working. So the reason I say this is we might often be drawn to things like comfort, but actually not long-term fit for purpose. So to condense my answer, I would always try to provide advice, even if it's not a selected chair of choice. I would try and give guidance to make sure that people are buying appropriate equipment that's fit for task, rather than giving sort of carte blanche choice.
Yeah, definitely. And just to back that up, Catherine, sorry to jump in there, is that backache is such a vague term. It could be just acute sort of stiffness that's just sort of, you know, progressed quite quickly. However, it could be a chronic medical condition that we're not actually aware of at this stage. So, you know, a virtual assessment such as over Teams could be a good approach, or just to have some sort of informal discussion just to see, and then that could work quite nicely to see exactly what sort of chair would be needed to help.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's certainly, you know, an adjustable chair is usually going to be better than a sofa, but then that might work for, you know, half day every so often. But then if you're going to go up to 3 days a week, you're going to need something a little better. So it really is appropriate for the person, the tasks that they do, and also does it fit into the house as well. So yes, I think some definite advice would be a step in the right direction on that one. So okay, so I'm just having a quick review. Somebody asked if they get a certificate of attendance. If you do want a certificate of attendance, if you could just email us or pop it in the chat with your email, and we'll get you a certificate out to you, so that we can do that for you. There's a challenge here. I have a partner who works at home, and so it means they have 2 setups plus technical issues and shared home situation. Anyone want to sort of talk about tips for a home situation, perhaps limited space? Maybe I will. Oh, Huw, there you go. Do you want to add a comment on that one at all?
Yeah, this has cropped up quite a lot for us. What we've tried to do is do the obvious thing, make recommendations that they split their time. So 1 week somebody's at home 2 days, in the office 3 days, and vice versa the following week. That's worked in a number of cases. You also have to think about things like confidentiality. So what's being said by one partner doesn't necessarily need to be heard by somebody on the phone to another partner. So we've had to sort of remind people of data privacy issues around joint working at home. So that's been a challenge. But then it's about, again, making people think. So if you're just doing a phone call, go and sit in the lounge. If you're doing some typing, sit at the desk and try and juggle that between you the best you can. But as with all of these things, there is no one perfect solution.
No, and I think, you know, if you can share a workspace, you can set it up really well, can't you? And if you could alter your time, but we are getting lots of requirements for smaller equipment. And I think the one thing COVID has done is put pay, oh, I've got my screen on, put pay to paper. You know, we've been trying to go paperless for years. And I actually think that COVID has reduced the amount of paperwork quite a lot, and thus the space sometimes you need. So we are seeing that equipment and desk requirements and things are getting smaller as well.
But I also think on that same subject, Catherine, there's been a whole shift in the understanding of neurodiverse issues.
Yes.
So people who would be able to sit, read papers are struggling to read digital media.
Yeah.
There's a whole host of things that goes on. So you then start looking at what types of software are available to support those individuals. Dragon Naturally Speaking, Read Write, all those sorts of things, and we're seeing lots more people using those.
Yeah. Oh, you're sadly speaking my language. I mean, I have to say I really struggle to read on screen sometimes, a large amount of text, and I still probably do use forests at home, but
Yeah.
but I know that's right. So we've got somebody asking about if someone is really resisting having a DSE compliant at home due to flat size, are we, the employer, well within our rights to say hybrid working is not for this person then? Gosh, that's a loaded one. I'll start off on that one. I mean, I will preface it, but I am not a lawyer. However, I would go back to, we're doing a risk assessment. If we think that the setup of that person for the tasks that they do and the duration they do it is putting them at risk, then I think we need to take appropriate steps. And for many of my clients, the control measure they put in place is to say, in which case you need to come into the office. So it is a generalized answer, but if somebody is at risk, you need to do something about it. And that's what the HSE and I think the lawyers would expect you to do. Huw, you're nodding. I hope anything you want to add to that, or do you think pretty much covers it?
No, I think if you mentioned in my chat earlier, I said we then have a conversation with manager and or individual, and that could result in you're not a hybrid worker, you're an office worker.
Yeah. And it is a difficult one, particularly if you live in an urban area, and particularly for perhaps newer members of staff. You know, our houses are getting smaller rather than bigger, aren't they? So we also have to be very aware of that.
One of the biggest groups that give us challenges are young people who are still living at home with parents.
Yes.
Don't want work environments coming into their houses. It's all right if it's them doing it, but they don't want their kids bringing it in, and that's been a really interesting challenge for us.
Yes. No,
manufacturers are sort of caught in the back of that, and you know, equipment has changed a lot over the last couple of years. So there's equipment like fold-away desks, and portability is really quite key at the moment. So yes, it can be quite difficult and like a daily challenge for myself, but there are sort of workarounds to try and help with that sort of compliance side of things. It's quite often, you know, I sort of recommend bring the desk out during the day when you are working or studying, and at the end of the day you can sort of fold it behind the door underneath the bed, and that's been sort of a good workaround, because it's usually as desks the biggest thing, the sort of the biggest query that I personally am getting day to day.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. This one I think very much for you, Neil. During the course of a basic DSE assessment, were you to identify a more complex health issue, how might you approach that situation?
So that's a good question. So personally, I've got 5 years of experience, and you know, I really do carry sort of 5 to 10 different assessments out every single day. So there is quite a broad range there, from all sorts of, you know, chronic and medical conditions, from, you know, MS, MD, cancer, all these things. But if there is something that I personally don't think I am the best person to speak to, then Posturite do have other resources, whether it's a higher level assessment or neurodiversity, like Huw's correctly mentioned. If like, for example, if we need to dyslexia, dyspraxia, all these things come up quite often as a part of, almost as like an add-on. So yes, I've got back pain, but I've also got this. So it's quite often I actually have to refer them to other services just to get then the correct results. That's important. That's the main goal of what I'm doing. It'll be the same with all assessors.
I was going to say, and sometimes we have, you know, long-term relationships with our clients, and I think, you know, for example, I can maybe cite Huw as an example. You know, if one of his staff, we came across something that we were concerned about, we would speak to the referrer, the person from the business, and say, do you have a process that you'd like us to follow? So I think we work very closely with people on that. So thank you very much for that. We've got one from Paul. We have ergonomic equipment for employees to trial. Excellent. Perhaps diagnosed by a physician. Does this equipment come with advice to reduce effects to help these ailments? Does anyone want to answer that, or shall I leap in? John, you look as if you might want to leap in on that one.
I mean, I was just going to say it's slightly dependent on the equipment that you're referring to, but we do try to have a lot of resources available around video advice. So on our website, there's quite a lot of videos available, also via our YouTube channel. So hopefully, I would say feel free to reach out to us with the particular equipment that you're mentioning, and we would look to be able to try to provide some advice around that and how they can support.
Yeah. I think so. I think there's lots of resources, there's lots of videos. If anyone wanted any support, just give us a shout. We have a great DSE advice team. Please just, our aim is to support people with any of their ergonomic needs. So just reach out to us if you need to, if the information you have isn't appropriate. Oh gosh, there's lots coming through now. We may not get through all of these. On a company-wide basis, we're looking to provide a new office chair, but how do you supply the correct chairs when one style doesn't suit all? I think that's one for John, I'm afraid. John, over to you.
Yeah, well, firstly, I would say great question, and even better the fact that you are flagging that now. I can't say the amount of times I've been to clients who have all new chairs company-wide and perhaps haven't considered the health and safety needs, and now retrospectively working on that. So great, firstly, that is being flagged. What I would say is we have a sort of projects division sort of dedicated to this, and we have a lot of research around what chairs might cover the greatest percentile of people. So really, I think what we're dealing with here is trying to firstly grab the greatest number that we can that are happy, but also chairs that perhaps then allow the flexibility to perhaps alter them to then suit the percentile of people that don't fit in with the chair as it is originally spec'd, if that makes sense. So my ultimate statement would be, again, this is one definitely to reach out to us on with that question, and we can come back with lots of the sort of studies and research and projects that we've done where we have supplied chairs for people company-wide, and we have the statistics around how many people haven't initially been comfortable and how we've been able to resolve that for the small percentage of people that weren't. Would be my answer to that one, I think, Catherine.
I think so. I think there's also a lot to be said. A lot of the chairs have lots of flexibility these days, but it is quite a balance because, of course, the more levers and wheels and things you provide with chairs, the more opportunity for people not to set up correctly there is. So it is a very fine balance between providing a very flexible chair and a chair that's going to be used easily for most people most of the time. So as I think probably I would join you, John, and say, reach out to people who deal in this, get some chairs in on trial and see how they work for you. It would be great if there was one brilliant chair that had a lot of flexibility that suited everybody, but there just isn't. But we can seat a very large percentage of the population on a fairly standard chair with certain flexible parameters. So I hope that helps. It doesn't give you a complete answer, but I hope it helps. I think we've really got time for one more. We've got a team member who has a fold-up desk and chair due to lack of space and lives too far away from an office. What solution would you offer? Not sure we can come up with one solution, but Neil, any thoughts on questions you'd ask or that sort of thing to help them along with that?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on what the team member is originally querying. Like, do they have an issue with the chair, or is the desk not large enough, or are they actually quite happy with that? And it's more of a business point of view. It's quite a loaded question, to be honest with you. So I would sort of reach out to that team member and just see if there are any queries that they have around their own setup. If there is, feel free to reach out to myself. My email is on that earlier on, and any questions, I'm more than happy to help. It really sort of does depend on what that team member is reporting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, fold up chair, on the face of it, you go, oh, I'm not sure. But, you could be lucky that the chair is exactly the right height. And it could be that that person isn't doing a lot of inputting. So there may be situations where it would be appropriate, although I think we would all be concerned that in many situations it wouldn't be appropriate. So you need a bit more background. You've got to look at the person and the other situation, haven't you, really?
Yeah, it sort of depends on what space is available. That's massive, really, to be honest with you. The fold-out desk could be quite a decent size, and it's just a chair we need to look at, or vice versa. So yeah, feel free to reach out to myself. I'm more than happy to help.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we've got any time for any more questions. I've got just one comment that somebody's made is also just sort of stating that, of course, if the home becomes a de facto place of work, obviously there are other health and safety issues, not just DSE. Obviously we focused on the computer and people using with computer equipment today, but yes, if the home is a place of work, we do need to be mindful of other health and safety issues. So that's a good comment. Thank you for that one. So I'm going to do a wrap. Thank Neil, John, and particularly Huw for giving up their time today, and for everybody sort of joining in and asking questions. I hope that's been helpful. And I would like to say that I hope you can join us for our next webinar that's on the 11th of October. And it's on ADHD. Interesting that we were talking about particular needs and enabling everybody with different ways of working and different makeups. So I think that would be a very, very interesting webinar. I mean, there was a news article the other day that was saying that so many people are now realizing that they've actually suffer with ADHD, and they thought it was other things. So I think that will be a very useful webinar. So I hope that the rest of your day goes well, and I look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you and goodbye.